Julian Barnett of London, giving you a slightly different tour today. We've got used to walking around the streets of London, looking at buildings, going on the outside in the parks and the cemeteries and so on. But quite a few people have asked me, Julian, why don't you do something, go off on a slightly different tangent and take people into your home? And I thought, why not? So here we are in the living room of my home, and I'm standing right amidst lots and lots of my possessions that I've collected over the years. As you can gather pretty quickly, I am not one of the great minimalists of the world, and I do like collecting. So what I decided to do today was really, almost randomly, wander around the room and look at 3 or 4 items in the room on this little tour and tell you the stories behind them and maybe weave some form of connection between them all. Let's see if that works. If it doesn't work, I'll just tell you some interesting things about some interesting objects, but I can immediately think that there are some connections. Let's start off over here. This is one of the pride of my collection. And this is my collection of Islamic tiles. They date from all types of periods, from 11th century through to 19th century, in fact through to early 20th century. And as you can see, they're of different colours and of different styles and so on. What I would really like to draw your attention to is this pair here. And this pair has a very interesting story. Let me first show you something about them from this book. This is one of the authoritative books on Islamic tiles by Venetia Porter of the British Museum. And if you go on to this page, I'm taking to you now, you can see that this pair of tiles here is actually shown here. It's one of a version of 3 different types that you would get, of which I'm going to tell you about. And I'm going to show you 2 pictures before I move on to the story of these tiles. One is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, very famous Golden Dome shrine. And the second is a close-up of some of these tiles. There they are sitting on the Dome of the Rock. There's a close-up of these tiles, and there it is again. If you look very closely here, you can see these tiles more or less like that, at that angle, on the Dome of the Rock. And now let me tell you the story of these tiles. The Dome of the Rock is the 3rd holiest shrine in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. Mecca being the place of the Kaaba, the very earliest place of Islamic worship, although the Kaaba, that cuboid structure, by Islamic tradition was not actually built by Muhammad, it was built by Abraham, fell into idolatrous use, and Muhammad then rededicated it to the worship of one God during his lifetime. Medina, the place where Muhammad is buried. And Jerusalem, the only city in the Islamic world given the honorific title Al-Quds, the Holy. It's the only city in the world to have that title. Now, round about the year 631, thereabouts, there is the fabled story of Muhammad's night flight from Mecca to heaven on El-Burak, the winged animal. I say winged animal because it's often called winged horse, but we're not actually told that in the Quran. It's just a winged creature, soon identified as a horse. He flies to heaven via Jerusalem. He goes to Jerusalem, lands on what had been the site of the 1st and 2nd temples, and from there ascends from the rock where Abraham had almost sacrificed Isaac, according to the Jewish tradition, Ishmael, according to the Islamic tradition, and he goes to heaven. Very soon after the death of Muhammad, Jerusalem becomes highlighted as one of those holy cities. In the Quran, it's not called Jerusalem, it's just called Al-Aqsa, the most remote, or the furthest. But it is Al-Aqsa, referred to in the Quran, is soon identified as Jerusalem. So Jerusalem becomes the focal point for some of those really early Islamic structures, one of them being the Golden Dome, Dome of the Rock. In the very, very late 7th century, we see the first octagonal structure built upon the site of the 1st and 2nd temples. But by the time we get whizzing forward to the 16th century, that had fallen into a state of disrepair. Suleiman the Magnificent, the 2nd Ottoman Emperor, orders the beautification of the site, and he orders it to be covered in the most wonderful tiles, created, designed and fired in Iznik in southern Turkey. And these pair of tiles are from the Dome of the Rock, made in 1552. You can often tell because you can see the telltale signs of these holes at the side of the tiles, whereby they will be bolted into the building. They're heavy, they have a wonderful lustre to them because of the high quartz content within the actual firing process. And they are the most beautiful things. Very, very hard, as you can imagine, to come by tiles that have been on the Dome of the Rock. But there they are, a pair of them, from the third holiest city in Islam and one of the holiest shrines in Islam. Let's move on to something completely different. Follow me over here to the desk. And on this desk, as you can see, is a pretty old book. It's one of my oldest books. I'm going to open this book now. This book was printed in 1648. And what's so lovely about it, as well, of course, as its age, is the two things that are in the cover. It's a Bible. I'd like to read you the text of the Bible as it is. The Holy Bible containing the Old Testament and the New, translated out of the original tongues and with the former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's Special Commissioners and by his command. Printed by Roger Daniel Printer, University of Cambridge, 1648. Now there's two wonderful things I'd like to point out. The first is the pictures at the bottom. There is a picture, if we can take that camera right in, there is a picture of London. Look at that picture of Old London Bridge crossing the river and Old St Paul's Cathedral. Remember, Old St Paul's Cathedral, we're talking about the St Paul's Cathedral before the current domed structure. So this is the medieval structure with the tower. This is a snapshot of London as it would have been then. The other thing about the picture is the pictures of Moses and Aaron. Moses has the cross of St George, one of the symbols of the city of London, hanging from beneath him there. There it is, the cross of St George. Aaron has the symbol of the high priest during the Jewish temple times, because Aaron was, of course, the brother of Moses, and he was the first high priest, or the first of the priests at that time. So we have the symbol of the priesthood from beneath him. So, in a way, this really shows that key relationship of the Judeo-Christian code that plays such a part in the culture, European culture, that we are part of. The other thing I found quite enchanting was this page here, because here we have somebody, I would suspect, looking at these letters from round about 300 years ago, who had done something as normal and as homely as practicing their handwriting. They're practicing writing out the alphabet in the front cover of their little Bible. Isn't that just such a lovely human touch? Let me take you on to the next thing I'd like to show you. And the next thing is this. This is Narcissus. Now, Narcissus is one of the gods of the ancient world. You might recall the story of Narcissus. He is completely obsessed and infatuated with himself and with his own beauty. And in fact, he dies as a result of that self-obsessiveness by looking at his beautiful reflection into the pool where he can see his face. It is, of course, where we get the whole idea of narcissistic from, people who are self-obsessed and totally self-absorbed, etc., etc. A little bit lighter. This Narcissus was made in around about 1871. It is a really fine quality copy of the Narcissus that was found during archaeological excavations of Pompeii in 1862. A relatively unimportant house was found in Pompeii. We don't know who lived there, but in that house, a bronze Narcissus was found. It's magnificent. The original now stands in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. But it kicked off a craze and interest in Narcissus. And round about 1,200 of these were made, really beautiful scale models of the original. But here's the great thing. The original Narcissus is, like most classical statues, naked, not a thing on him. But this was made for export. This was made in order to export in particular to Britain, rather prudish Victorian Britain. So the creators of this beautiful bronze, when they made it in the very early 1870s, had to make it palatable to their clientele back in London and the provinces. How would they do that? Well, they put on a removable fig leaf. So there you have the original Narcissus as he is in Pompeii, in all his glory. But to make it sellable and probably legal in Victorian Britain, they made a very, very elegant fig leaf to cover himself up for modesty. I must tell you that to have 19th century Narcissus with his original fig leaf is quite a rare thing, because as you can see, the fig leaf is just loosely attached. So this makes this particularly collectible, the fact that it has its original fig leaf on it, and it just makes it, as well as being a reference to an ancient legend, and as well as it has a reference to gods of the ancient world, and to Pompeii, and to archaeological dig of 1862, it is also a lovely social comment on how our Victorian forefathers actually really interpreted and made flexible old things to make them acceptable to the society for which they were making this bronze for. And finally, let me take you round to this very interesting little piece. You can see here a wooden head. I bought this at an auction. Well, it wasn't really an auction. It was a sort of street auction in a very rough neighbourhood way out in East London, about 25 years ago. I paid peanuts for it. To be exact, £6. I checked my records. £6 I paid for this. You can see that it's a rather nice 3D effect. It's a head of a rather noble looking man, carved, here is the amazing thing, out of one piece of wood. One piece of wood. I purchased it, and that was that. Lived with it for a long time. Many, many years later, I was travelling around Norfolk and Suffolk and looking at the churches in those counties. Remember, Norfolk and Suffolk were, in their time in the medieval period, some of the wealthiest counties in England due to the wool trade. And the churches that were built in Norfolk and Suffolk towns and villages are often to this day called the wool churches, because they were built on the huge amount of money made by the medieval wool trade. I went into one such church, which I shan't name today, and that church had a wooden screen just before the chancel. The screen had on it 39 carvings, just like this, of the Saxon and Norman kings. And I looked along all these carvings and I thought they looked just like the one I've got there. And then I noticed one of the carvings was missing. It had the holder for it, but not the actual carving. To cut a long story short, I got speaking to the curate, who then passed me on to the priest, and eventually I spoke to one of the leading people in the diocese. And I was told that they are in fact missing two of the originals. One they made a copy of in the Victorian times to fill it up, and the other they've just never got round to filling. Well, I went back home, I had a look at it, I found out that this is King John, and indeed, this is the missing one from that church. So I've made a promise that when I shuffle off this world and I'm no longer here, that is going back to the church. And that will be my donation to keeping the wonderful, wonderful traditions and beauties of English parish churches going, soon to go back to its original place. So there are 4 items that I've shown you today. I think I will be doing another tour of some of the rooms in my home in due course. I suppose now that we're at home, let me just end this off with a little toast. The toast is first and foremost to you, the viewers, who have once again, I hope, tuned in and enjoyed these few minutes. But I suppose the second thing I'm toasting to is to some of the things I've shown you today. It is, I suppose, a toast to the collection and the enjoyment of things of beauty. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this tour, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.